Let me start with a story. There's a guy in a hot air balloon, and he's lost, and then he sees a woman down on the ground. So he lowers the balloon, and he says, "Excuse me, I'm lost. Can you tell me where I am?" And she looks up and she says, "Well, you're in a hot air balloon hovering approximately 30 feet above the ground. You're between 40 and 41 degrees north latitude and between 59 and 69 degrees west longitude." And the guy says, "Oh, you must be an engineer." And she says, "You're right, I am. How did you know?" And he says, "Well, you gave me a lot of technical information, but I'm still lost. You haven't helped me at all." And she says, "You must be a manager." And he says, "I am. How did you know?" And she says, "Well, first, you have no idea where you are. Second, you have risen to where you are due to a large quantity of hot air. And third, you expect people beneath you to solve your problems, yet you are in exactly the same position you were before we met, but now it's my fault." Well, that's the impression we have of managers, don't we? Oh, he's just gotten to where he is because of hot air. And he bosses people around, expects them to solve his problems, and in the end, if they do something wrong, he blames them. It's their fault, right? You ever have a boss like that? How about a boss like this? "When I do good, my boss never remembers. When I do wrong, he never forgets." Well, a bad manager can make your job unbearable. And if you got a bad boss, it's probably time to quit, right? Well, today we want to talk about ethical management. And one of the concepts in management is hierarchy, because a manager is in a position of authority. And on the top, it says that we tend to listen to authority out of respect. Sometimes we respect them. Fear, often, we're afraid of them. And thirdly, sometimes belief in their expertise. Do you remember the Milgram experiment? The, the subject listened to the scientist, an authority figure, out of respect to him as a scientist, and maybe a bit of fear because he was quite uh, assertive, and belief in the scientist's expertise. And so we tend to listen to authority figures, and that means we tend to listen to the manager. And if we want to be an ethical manager, we have to understand that. And ethical managers actually allow people to question authority. There's nothing wrong with questioning your boss. And employees are empowered to make their own decisions, use their talents, do work in a way that suits their own style instead of being micromanaged. I mean, no one likes a boss who's always hovering over them, telling them exactly what to do. No, we don't like managers like that. We want a manager who trusts us, who allows us the freedom to make our own decisions, to make to do work the way that suits our own style and to use our abilities and talents. Tell you a story. You recognize this guy? If you say Stan Lee, you're right. He is the comic book creator. He created the great comic book characters of Spider-Man, Iron Man, Hulk, Captain America, and many more. Well, Stan Lee, he passed away at 95 years old in 2018. But years ago, when he was a young man, he worked for a comic book company called Timely Comics, which is actually the predecessor to Marvel. And back then, his boss told him to write comic books the way everybody else wrote comic books, which was no plot, lots of action. Bad guy fights with good guy, good guy beats up bad guy, the end. Pow, pow, pow. Lots of action. Forget about plot. Forget about character development. I mean, comic books are just comic books. Lots of action. Pow, 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 right? Well, Stan Lee wrote comic books that way for a while, but then he got bored and he just felt that his job had no purpose and he wanted to quit. Fortunately, he told his wife about his frustrations, and his wife gave him some wise advice. She said, "Well, why don't you just write your next comic the way you want? The worst thing that will happen is you'll be fired, but you want to quit anyway, so you've got nothing to lose." And so Stan Lee followed his wife's advice and he wrote the Fantastic Four, which had a real plot, character development, some action, yes, but not too much action. So it was a real story, a real, almost like a novel, a short novel, a real story. And not only kids loved it, but adults loved it as well. And it sold out, and his boss was so impressed at the sales, he told Stan Lee to write more comics that way. And he did. And he developed more characters. And of course, you know the story. Eventually, Stan Lee developed a comic book franchise which was made into movies, which became the greatest blockbusters of all time, like The Avengers, which is the greatest selling movie of all time. And Stan Lee said, none of that would have happened without the conversation I had with my wife back in 1961. So essentially, his wife told him, "Oh, forget about your boss. Just do the comics, write them the way you want to write them. Use your talents as a writer and do it." And so, what we're saying is that ethical managers allow their employees to question them and set the employees free to often do things the way they want to do them, using their own gifts, their own talents, their own style. And eventually that's for the entire company, because it sets employees free to fully utilize their abilities, which contributes to the company. And of course, Stan Lee, he created, because of what he did, Timely Comics eventually became Marvel Comics and became the greatest comic book company of all, and eventually bought up by Disney. And now we have movies like The Avengers and others. So empower your employees. Allow them to question authority. That's part of ethical management. Another topic of management in this chapter is groups and teams, and specifically norms. So groups go through phases or stages. And as groups develop through the stages, they develop norms. Norms, remember, are rules. And rules can be good or bad. And it says in this slide that as groups go through the phases, norms develop, the rules develop. And some norms can cause moral or ethical problems. Like in the example of Enron. Enron employees believed it was acceptable to manipulate energy prices and cause people in California to suffer through electrical power shortages. See, Enron bought the electrical company in California, and their boss, Jeffrey Skilling, he encouraged his employees to make money any way they can, and they caused these artificial power shortages, which caused great problems in California and a lot of suffering. And as a result, Californians had a miserable summer. But Enron, in the meantime, made lots of money because they were able to manipulate the prices of electricity, and they made money on the trading of electricity. So Jeffrey Skilling of Enron was kind of a cult-like leader who encouraged his employees to do anything, even unethical things, in order to make money. And in real life, we have cults, are groups with deadly norms. Some examples: back in November of 1978, in Guyana, South Africa, 918 people committed mass suicide because their cult leader, he kind of manipulated them and encouraged them to commit this mass suicide by drinking poison Kool-Aid. And so sometimes we have the expression, well, drink the Kool-Aid, that comes from this cult. I drank the Kool-Aid. And so this idea of an unethical cult leader led uh, his followers to ultimately kill themselves because he developed deadly norms in his group. I think of David Koresh in Waco, Texas. He was a cult leader, and in 1993, he developed such a evil cult. He was controlling his followers that the FBI raided his compound. But instead of surrendering, he encouraged or manipulated his followers to set fire to the compound. And in the end, they all died. 54 adults, including Koresh himself, and 21 children died. A great tragedy. And again, it shows you the power of a leader, in this case, a cult leader, to develop harmful, unethical, immoral norms, which people follow. They follow the leader of their groups and develop these norms which can hurt them. And so, as I said, one of the problems with Enron was their CEO, Jeffrey Skilling. He was like a cult-like leader who led his employees, encouraged his employees to do unethical actions. And eventually, that's why Enron got involved with a lot of scandal and led to their downfall. And I contrast that with a leader like Howard Schultz, considered one of the great ethical leaders, founder of Starbucks. And he says that a company can grow big without losing passion and personality that built it, but only if driven by values and people, not by profits. And so he's an ethical leader who believes in developing ethical norms for his employees. And one of the ethical norms these days is diversity, having an inclusive workplace, respect for all people. These days, there's the emphasis on LGBT to allow people of different sexual orientation to work just like everyone else without discrimination. And in fact, the leader of Apple, Tim Cook, CEO, is gay. And he says, let me be clear, I'm proud to be gay. And I consider being gay among the greatest gifts God has given to me. So ultimately, managing the climate of an organization, an ethical manager creates a high performance organization. And a high performance organization is a force that is committed to the vision and values of the company. So a company where managers are ethical creates an organization where employees like to go to work. Work is something that they take pride in. They find joy and fulfillment through, rather than saying, oh, I just go to work because I got to pay the bills. A company that is an example of a high performance organization is Google. And they're famous for their management. Employees have said Google is an amazing company that looks to improve the skills and experience of our employees. People are always supporting one another. This company has been fabulous, and I appreciate everything they've done for all their employees and staff here. So a high-performance organization creates an environment where the employees are empowered, set free to develop their gifts and abilities, to do work in their own style, to contribute to the company. And they've got ethical norms where people are supporting one another, moral norms. And ultimately, they follow their managers who allow people to question authority, and they have good interaction, creating a company where people really want to go to work.